Okay.
Well, these two you had half.
Yeah.
Away by one.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my hope is I'm throwing huge amounts of information. My kind of request of the way is to try and see the big picture rather than get focused on the details. But I'm using the details to illustrate this is not just a kind of made up thing. You can actually go down into details, but the trouble is the details are too much to really try and put all together in one go. But I'm increasing, and probably the next session won't be like this at all. We'll be much more focused on the gospel text. But there is a story that I just think that a lot of people haven't been shown before. So my hope in one sense is to kind of tell a story that isn't regularly told. So the period where we're going to start, don't worry, I'm not going through the slide yet, so everyone grab a coffee, do I know that? We're into Rome is now emerging, Fourth Empire. Again, it's interesting. If you go to look at Pentecostal pictures of the four beasts, anyone look at Pentecostal pictures of the four beasts in Daniel? The fourth beast is horrendous. It's kind of because it isn't actually described, so people make it really whatever. It is sort of described. It's sort of with horns and whatever. But most Jewish scholarship sees it as a boar, which is why I put it as a boar. And actually that makes sense because the boar is actually seen as with the Roman legions. They kind of had a boar in the thing. So and there's no reason why it can't be a boar. But if you go and look at very often kind of the most lurid kind of Pentecostal pictures of them, it kind of looks like something more like from that old film, The Jabberwocky, you know, that has all sorts of. But anyway, that's a total slide. Now, okay, let's get back. So we come to the beginning of the New Testament period now, and Jesus is going to be born into this melee. People are talking about the Messiah. Some people believe there's one Messiah, some people believe there are two, some believe there are three, some believe there's three plus a prophet, some believe they're all messianic. You've got these conversations going on amongst the different groups, and things are never uniform. Beware of anyone that tells you that any period of history everyone thought this. That's never the case. There's always a kind of a range of things, and that's what I'm trying to get across. So Jesus is born into this mess. We have a king who will do this next time when we start with the beginning of the birth of Jesus, who is really highly resented. He's come from, there are some who see him, Herod, as a new Messiah because under Herod the Great, they become great again. They get as big as they were under the Hasmoneans. So some are saying he's a messianic figure. So we see them probably referred to as the Herodians. And they root their way, they're thinking back to a rabbi, I think his name is Boethius, something like that, who saw what Herod achieved, even though he's a totally despicable character, is in he kind of representing that you can sneak into kind of biblical religion, think of it like the Pharisees like that, biblical religion, suddenly everything gets sacrificed, because if it works, we like it. Not saying anything about Trump at this stage, but you know how popular. If it works, we like it. Regardless of whatever else goes on, it's the kind of the way those things happen. So there are the Herodians, but there are lots of people expecting, but they're all a bit depressed because Herod has actually taken the king with the help of a Roman army. He's done a load of things that they don't like. The people are expecting the Messiah, but they thought they had one a century ago, and it could have related to the decree of Cyrus, but now it's all past that.
Can I just say, I think Herod is greatly misunderstood. He's a bit like that nice Mr. Putin. When you want to understand him.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, most of the women, most of the mothers in Israel were perfectly safe and so were their children. They're the ones 2 years and under. So he was actually mostly a
Yeah. I get what you're saying, making sure everyone gets your irony. Yeah. And I was going to say, when you said most of the women, I thought you were going to say he had them as wives. No, that's another story. There were at least 10. I say at least 10, because we're not sure about some of the others. No, we're not sure whether there are others. That way. So what we're going to focus, though, on is now, so Jesus is born in that context. We'll think about that next time, so there'll be a bit of an overlap between the end of the Old Testament and the birth narrative. But I just thought it's now worth taking a bit of time, because this is where we're going to go with, as we go forward, is to tell the story together, integrating the four Gospels and trying to draw in the history and the politics that's going on around, so that we can understand the story of Jesus as history. Very, very interesting kind of little marker here. I remember always used to hear it as a kid growing up. They were quite, Christianity is the only world religious faith that is really firmly rooted into history. Is that you can't take the ideas and disassociate them from history. And that's kind of, that is this is a true thing. So the story of Jesus is not the story of Buddha, which you can vaguely fit in, and you can take the teaching and you can apply it to anywhere. If that makes sense. It's not the same as pagan myths. When you look at myths, they're again abstract. They could have happened 500 years before, 100 years after. They're not rooted to those kind of things, whereas the story of Jesus is. So starting to see it in that way. And one of the things that came out of the Speaking Jesus survey was that people didn't really know whether they saw Jesus as a story rather than his history. And I regularly hear it. You think the person who's saying it has no idea how solid the evidence is for Jesus. I know it sounds we can say it because we're Christians, we just believe it. But actually, in terms of the way history works, it is far more certain than huge numbers of people that everybody thinks are certain. And we know in those ways. So anyway, we're going to do it in that way. So this hour, we're going to do two sections, the who and how of the Gospels. And then we'll look at the beginnings of the Gospels in the kind of the translation I'm trying to do, which sounds like a very arrogant thing to say. Because the way I'm doing it is because when you blend different sources together, the words might be the same. And the wonderful thing is the Strong's number system tells you what the word is. That makes sense? But the grammar of the word is different in the different Gospels. So I've just focused on what is the word. The fact that Luke might use the present tense and Mark might use the past tense, that's just style. I mean, was it that Jesus went to the synagogue, or Jesus is going to the synagogue when this happened? You get the idea? So I'm not a scholar, but I'm working with every word as they appear. I'm blending those words, I know enough to be able to do that with kind of confidence and say that's what's there. None of these replaces the gospel, but it creates a much more 360 narrative when you put all three together. Sometimes just two words from one gospel that joins with the two words from another, and suddenly you see a bigger picture. And equally, it tells you that they do fit together. And when I said I was doing this recently in my father's memorial, one of the people there, and he wasn't the only one of this, he was the head of the EA. When he asked what I was doing, and I said I'd done that, he said, "Is that possible?" Now, here's the head of the Evangelical Alliance. They believe in the Bible. Was saying, "But how did you manage to do that bit?" Because actually, we've so been told there are these contradictions, and just to see them fit together as a narrative, I think is kind of useful. When we do it more, I can explain why people don't. Very often, people don't go there because superficially things don't fit easily, or they look and they say, "Well, we could resolve it, but you can't tell which way to resolve it." And because they don't know which way to resolve it, they never feel really comfortable as to how it fits together. So there are times when it could have been resolved 3 or 4 different ways. I've chosen a way, and by choosing a way, it then locks in something else. So maybe I'm wrong, but what I'm trying to do is say they do tell a consistent story, and you can trust these stories. What's going on here? Auto power will turn off automatically.
That's the TV.
Oh, that's the TV. So you got the remote there. Time there, 276 seconds. Come on, Spike. Come on. There, it's gone now. Okay.
I couldn't read it, so far.
Yeah. So we're going to think about how and when the Gospels were written, who wrote the Gospels, fitting the Gospels together. The good news, I'll say this, it becomes more and more true every time I do this. When I first started to teach early dates on the Gospels, I had good academic sources, but less support more generally. If that makes sense. In other words, there are a number of key biblical scholars who believed that, but the general thing was often quite late. As every year goes by, more and more evidence is coming out, quite sophisticated evidence that means that the Gospels can't be seen as late as they used to. Even the fact, and let's just throw it out there, that it used to be said, look, the Gospels don't talk so much about the Sadducees, they only talk about the Pharisees, and the Pharisees didn't really emerge until after the... So they used to say that, but then they found, there were Pharisees around. But actually then someone said, yes, but when they do explain the Pharisees, they explain them in the present tense. These are who the Sadducees are. But the Sadducees didn't exist after the temple was destroyed. So what on earth is the gospel writer talking about people who he expects that you know who they are and they're still here? Do you see what I'm saying? So suddenly, and Jerusalem, there is in Jerusalem, not there was in Jerusalem. What idiot would write that if you know that the city has been destroyed? It doesn't exist in Jerusalem anymore. Jerusalem's not there, but it doesn't say that. So suddenly people are saying those things don't make sense. The context is always present tense, often for things that disappeared with the temple. Okay. So there's a very simple reason for and then you've got things like, let's come to the text. Come to the pictures. Because these are nice pictures to look at, see. So it used to be the kind of traditional way, which was kind of based on early church tradition, was that in Jerusalem you have a kind of sanctioned oral tradition, the teaching of the apostles as they work together, consolidate the stories. They're kind of teaching that orally in Jerusalem, and out of that, Matthew and Mark and Luke get written, and then in a separate process, John gets written. And that was for hundreds of years the way the world saw things. Until about 200 years ago, when people started to kind of say, well, we think the Gospels weren't written until much, much later. They had their reasons. They were often reasons that are no longer used in anything else in history. Only in biblical scholarship do they still use these kind of logic. But the basic logic was there was a church, clearly, very quickly, but the stories of Jesus must have grown with time. That was the logic. And so, therefore, we want to make these late. And so they started to postulate other things, like we'd all heard of Q when we did RE at school. You got the prize bike. Do you remember Q?
No, I didn't teach him either.
Okay. So the logic then was, well, Mark's the shortest gospel, so Mark must have been written first, and the Greek is not so hot in Mark as it is in Luke and John. So Mark was clearly written first, or Matthew, in fact. Mark was clearly, because it's kind of a rough, stupid person's gospel. That's the way they saw it. But then there was obviously some other things, and then Matthew and Luke drew from Q. So that was the logic, and people went with that. But then people started to look in detail, and then John was kind of whenever, a couple of hundred years later, who knows. And then as people looked at it, they said, no, that doesn't work well enough, so we have to think about other sources. Because if we're trying to create Matthew from Mark, you need more than just one source that's different. And you need a source that's different from what goes into Luke. And maybe Luke actually seems to have several different versions. And that there were reasons for every line I put on here. There was logic for all of these lines. Just trying to show it. It was M, Q, and L. So these are labels that added to the source. So Matthew has a unique source for Matthew, M. He also used Mark. And then there was also Q, which was kind of used by the first version of Luke. But he also had his own source, so L is the pre-source. So these were other documents, and these weren't oral traditions, because they could find the reasons why they weren't oral, that sort of thing. So they put these lines together. But even that didn't hold up. And that image is seriously somebody's theory as to how the Gospels got written. So... And it's not 100% wrong, because there is logic behind these things. It's just that they're rejecting the traditional view, which I think explains all of these things. So you've got these different sources, you've got various iterations of each of the Gospels. The only thing everybody agrees on is Mark's written first, even though all of the ancient sources tell us it wasn't. And they give us a perfectly good reason why it's not as sophisticated as the others, but it also has its strengths. So a typical modern multi-source intermediate step solution to how the Synoptic Gospels got written. So that's the way things were until quite recently, I'm talking 30, 40 years, but with every year it gets more and more. Because actually, there are things like a statistical analysis of the names used in the Gospels actually proves with something like 95 to 99% certainty that they are actual eyewitness accounts from the time that they claim to be. Okay, so how do you work that out? Well, that's a new technique that's emerged in historical history research, which is you know from hard physical evidence how names are assigned in a community and what class of people they belong to and things like that. So you can come up with a whole load of statistical rules from hard physical evidence. And then you compare that with a document, and if the document matches up, you can actually say that was written at the same time and by people who really knew the situation. And if it doesn't, you can say that was written 50 years after, 100 years after, by someone who was writing a story about things. Does that make sense? And so things like that are modern techniques, and the Gospels are suddenly proving incredibly good and incredibly old. So that is thrown out. Now, that's wrong. This is a picture. It looks a bit fuzzy, but actually it makes a lot of sense. And this is, for me, is where I've settled. So Matthew, we're told by all of the ancient sources, writes first. I think you see it in the Gospels, in that Matthew's call by Jesus takes up more verses than the calls of James, John, Peter, and Andrew. Add them up, all four of them. If you actually count how many verses are dedicated to the call, because Matthew's call doesn't just happen of Jesus calls him from the tax booth. It actually is, he calls them to tax booths, and Matthew puts on a meal, remember? And lots of people come, and Jesus says, when I'm gone, then they'll do it like this. He's talking in the context of Matthew's call about how people will know him after he's gone. Does that make sense? I think Jesus chose Matthew deliberately to do what the early church tells us was that he used to write down when Jesus was teaching, and that actually he becomes, if you like, the amanuensis for the group of the apostles. And Matthew's gospel, therefore, is coming out of, as they sit together and they agree, the codex hasn't been invented yet, but the simple way of getting a sermon out is on single sheets. Not on a scroll, but on single sheets. So Matthew's gospel is structured in single sheet size pieces. It's kind of made, here's a sermon, and here are some parables that kind of come at about the same time. Here is a sermon, and here are some illustrations of events that happened about this time. Here is a sermon. It works through that way. So that's how Matthew's gospel is written. This kind of, so you can imagine how as they're working together, those sheets are being put together, and the ancient text, the early church tells us that Matthew wrote them down, but that they got distributed and copied and developed by different people. But one of whom probably is Matthew himself. But there are multiple. In other words, those stories become the apostles' teaching. So when we read about in Acts, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They are consolidating those stories. Why? Because hundreds of thousands of people have heard Jesus. Stories are going all over the place of things he said. Some of them might be true, some aren't. So let's make sure we've got a body of work that we all agree on. He said, we remember it. We issue it, and yeah, do you know what? Joe might have been there when he heard Jesus say, blessed are the cheesemakers, but the official version is blessed are the peacemakers. You see the way it goes. And so that's the reason. And so Matthew is actually being written in Jerusalem almost from the moment that Jesus is resurrected and ascends to heaven. We start to see Matthew is emerging. Matthew, therefore, doesn't name people on the whole. In fact, he deliberately obscures who individuals are, because actually by 44 there's a large persecution going on of the church. So you don't want to kind of tell a big story about Lazarus and his resurrection, because we actually know from other early church fathers that Lazarus is really disliked because he's a wealthy man and he's a big testimony to who Jesus was and the miracle that's happened, and he is forced to leave the area. So he ends up in Cyprus. That's what traditions tell us about Lazarus. But you see, we don't mention him. And so we don't mention the name of the woman who anoints Jesus, you see. And maybe we even give her a kind of a pseudonym, Mary Magdalene. Well, why is Magdalene? Is it Mary Magdalene? Well, we're not really sure, but she's there. That's a good candidate. But Magdalene, there's actually a tower in Jerusalem called the Mary Magdalene, because Magdalene means tower. And she's a towering figure who is the first person who is anointed after the resurrection, or commissioned after the resurrection by Jesus to tell the story. So we give her perhaps a little bit of a nickname. So she may live in Bethany, but she's a tower. And did Jesus meet her in Magdala or not? I don't know. But you see how you can suddenly start to see why Matthew writes the way he does, because of the history he's writing in. We're also told he originally wrote them in Hebrew. Again, people said, oh, well, that must be Aramaic. It turns out from the Dead Sea Scrolls that often revered religious texts are being written in Hebrew. So perhaps Matthew is collating them in Hebrew. But as things spread out from Jerusalem, where Hebrew is commonly spoken and understood by the religious communities there, it becomes harder and harder. And so you can understand why a Greek version is needed. You see. So Mark, we're told, is as Peter has to leave. Remember, Peter has to go. There's been an earthquake and he's escaped from prison. So he is now a wanted man who's escaped from prison. He hasn't been pardoned, so he leaves the area. He goes to another place, it says. Remember. And he takes John Mark with him. All of the early church records, both Catholic and Orthodox, tell us he's in Rome by 40 AD. So he's there with Mark. And there we have a consistent story from, again, different sources, slightly different versions, but they fit together, which is that Peter is there preaching. When he and Mark is with him. When he leaves, they don't know who's there to preach. And Mark has heard Peter so many times, he writes out what Peter preached. And so if you read the accounts of the stories in Mark's Gospel, you will actually see that they are longer, they're not shorter. The same person who I mentioned when he was saying, because of course he said, Matthew's so much shorter. And I said, well, not in the detail. You take, he's got less events, but the events are about twice as long. So in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus meets a blind man and heals him. In Mark's Gospel, he meets a blind man, has a question or two with him, spits on the ground, makes some mud, puts it on his eyes, asks him a question. You see, when you put all of that in, you've got, actually, this is the free reign of somebody preaching who was really there. Does that make sense? And you see that all the time in Mark's Gospel. Has less events, but they're pulled from the same pool. Well, that makes sense, because Peter was there agreeing what the pool of events that they're going to say. We need to tell the whole story of Jesus. What are the events? These are the events. He's going to be preaching from that, but he's preaching now as an eyewitness, you see. When they're distributed as pages to be discussed as scripture around the dinner table, you've got, even if the source was an eyewitness, you don't have so much eyewitness detail, because this is what Jesus did. What does it mean? Does that make sense? So Mark's Gospel gives us that flavour. Luke's Gospel looks like it gets written around the same time, or started at around the same time. Paul actually quotes from Luke, and he refers to Luke's Gospel. Lots of time we don't realise that. Scholarship solves the first issue, the fact that Paul is quoting from Luke in 60 AD by saying, well, obviously, therefore, it's forgery. So it's which one is it? Where did you go? I think it's Titus. I think I've got it in here. Oh yeah, here are the various things. So yeah, Matthew writing almost immediately while church is based in Jerusalem. I've done some of those. Oh yeah, okay. I've put some things here on eyewitness inclusios. You find this regularly in the Synoptic Gospels and also in John. And it turns out, with later analyses, that it's an ancient world way of saying these are the people you need to talk to verify the story, which is you tell the person's story at the beginning of where their testimony becomes relevant, and you tell it again at the end. Does that make sense? And so you actually see that in Mark. that the very first person that we kind of really encounter other than Jesus that's significant to the story, you know, to the story of Jesus, is Jesus going by the Sea of Galilee, and there's Simon. First name, Simon. And the very last name, original ending, go and tell his disciples, and Peter, you see. So Simon at the beginning, Simon at the end, because Simon is key to the eyewitness of everything that follows between those two. That makes sense? Whereas in John's Gospel, there's an anonymous disciple and Andrew. Okay? And this is the disciple who bears witness to the very final line of the Gospel. I was there from here to here. See, I'm telling you where the source is. And that obsession with being clear on source is really important, because it's one of the things that marks them out not as a made-up story, because actually right the way through you find it subways as well. Subways. Nicodemus is introduced a couple of chapters into John's Gospel, and Nicodemus is told at the end, and his name comes up at the points where the disciples could never have been a witness, but Nicodemus pops up there each time. That makes sense? In other words, some of John's Gospel is different from ones you got from the Apostles, because we've had Nicodemus' perspective from the temple. You get that? Luke names and gives details of people who are known to the wider church, i.e. people like Joanna, Clopas, Mary and Martha, who are known in the wider church. So he names them because they're known in the Aegean churches that Paul has been planting. So that's those are comments on source. Is that okay on source? There's a as I say, you will still find increasingly, if you want a critic of this kind of source, you will find someone like Bart Ehrman, who's now there all as a critic, and he's not very convincing if you watch him. Just saying. But because actually it's harder and harder to maintain this story with every passing year. You know, it's that old adage that people say archaeology has always been a friend, even when sometimes it seems to contradict. It tends to move in the right direction. The historical evidence is pushing the understanding of the Gospels being earlier and earlier. So when you try and now fit the Gospels together, the story we have is you've got three that we could refer to the synoptic. They're taking the same perspective. And that perspective was the apostles that travelled with Jesus. Probably originally consolidated through Matthew in a very kind of vanilla-flavoured but comprehensive gospel. That's very rude of me, but it's actually one of my favourite books. I was going to say one of my favourite. I've got 4 favourite gospels. What I mean by vanilla-flavoured is he's made it easy to read and not too drawing you into the details. Well, I wonder why that is. But, it's kind of here's the facts, discuss, if that makes sense. So his first, then Mark gives us a lot more kind of the eyewitness imagery from Peter. Luke's gospel, where he says he's worked from multiple sources, he's added again a lot of extra detail, but those sources now are slightly wider. We won't have time to kind of look at where some of those sources are, but they are wider. John's gospel is a totally different perspective and includes a view from the temple, but interestingly, he ignores almost all of the kind of major flow of the synoptic gospels. And people would say, oh, it's a totally different tradition, whereas the answer really has always been, no, it's a supplementary position. If you don't retell what everybody's already got. Does that make sense? We've told you these individual teaching events. We're going to fit it into the history of the celebrations of feasts. So John's Gospel is always written from the perspective of a feast, which allows you to mark out. That makes sense? So when we come to fitting things together, you can find there are certain fixed dates. So, for instance, John the Baptist's ministry starts in the 15th year of Tiberius, so we can mark that, which then means when Jesus clears the temple at Passover, they refer to the temple being built for 42 years. Again, you can mark that within a year because there's a little bit of ambiguity of year as to when the original temple was restored by Herod, and then he started work on the outer parts. So the original temple had stood for years, it just was repaired, and then after the repair, it's just how long did that repair take? Was it 18 months or was it 2 years? So you get kind of a slight, but 40, you can actually mark that down. So we know that actually happens on the 7th of April in 30 AD. Can you see why? I'm not trying to be... They make the statement, this building has stood for. It's been there, and he's in the outer plaza. The original temple has stood for hundreds of years. It was repaired, but Herod started work on it after he repaired the temple. And it's now stood there, it's been there for 42 years, you see. So we can mark that date. Therefore, ministry in Samaria happens, you say 4 months to harvest. That's not a euphemism. There is no saying 4 months to harvest. It is literally, there are 4 months to harvest. Which ties in perfectly with it being Jesus just leaving after the Pentecost in 30 AD. He's heading out through Samaria. And so he's probably, remember how he's been baptizing more than John at that point. Why is he baptizing more than John? Because people are coming through for first of all Passover, and then they're coming for Pentecost, and there are millions of them coming, about hundreds of thousands of people coming to Jerusalem, crossing the Jordan where Jesus is baptized, his disciples are baptizing. They're baptizing more than in John's day. And after that, Jesus decides to head up through Samaria. Jesus goes to a festival in Jerusalem, which I've put down as probably Passover, John 5, verse 1. The disciples pluck grain. And again, we have a date in there. It's not obvious. But the Greek of some of the oldest manuscripts say on the first second Sabbath. It's a strange phrase. And people have theories as to what that meant, but most people just ignore it. So you'll see a certain Sabbath in English. The oldest manuscript we have on what that means is from Ephraim of Syria, who's writing in the 2nd century, who is probably at the time when people are forgetting what it meant, because the temple has now been destroyed, is that on the second day of unleavened bread, there is the wave offering. So the second, and that's the Sabbath, and then you start counting Sabbaths after that until you get to Pentecost. So the first Sabbath after the second, which is the day of the wave offering, does that make sense? So the second day of unleavened bread, the wave offering, after which you're allowed to eat grain, which is what's going on at this time. The disciples are going through on the first Sabbath, or the second Sabbath. Does that make sense? So they're now allowed to rub grain in their hands and eat it. But that is at work, so it's ambiguous. They're allowed to do it as long as it's not Sunday. That makes sense? See, that's right there. So that means we can mark this date. We can actually tell you what that date is. It's the 28th of April. Passover is at hand. Well, Passover is going to be on the 14th of April in John 6, the feeding of the 5,000. Then we start moving into the last kind of 18 months to a year. From that Passover, there's the Feast of Tabernacles, is referred to, the Feast of Dedication, and then finally the Crucifixion. So we can actually kind of mark out the beginnings and ends and fix that into a historical context. If you're reading older books, there was a tendency to favour earlier years because they saw Jesus getting baptized as soon as John turns up, and then squeezing everything into a short period, and then so that Jesus can be crucified on 30 AD. Realistically, 30 AD and 33 AD are the only sensible dates, because they allow the Passover to happen on the Friday for the Sunday. That makes sense. So that's why they wanted to squeeze it all into 3 years. But actually, as we do more, we see things spreading out. Actually, the 33 fits better. So chronological summary, I think they're in your notes. You can follow. There are also a number of those events distributed through John. He also then tells some other things that do coincide with the Gospels, with the Synoptic Gospels. So Jesus is with John the Baptist, that's in all 4 Gospels. Jesus comes to Galilee, that's in all 4 Gospels. Comes into Galilee, I should say. There's the feeding of the 5,000, that's in all of the Gospels. What's gone through too many? Jesus relocates to Judea, That is referred to in all four Gospels. And then there's the Feast of Dedication. Then he relocates also beyond the Jordan. And then there's the final. So those things marked in red allow us to link John's Gospel to the Synoptic Gospels. So you see how we're putting the layers together. We've got some dates that you can be concrete about. You've got some things that you can interlace so we can see how they tie together. What I've done is I've tended, and when sometimes there's individuals in working on things, you try to distribute according to what the text seems to be saying, how far apart things are, the events of the Synoptic Gospels and the other Gospels into that framework that we've created. Keep an eye on the time. Yeah, so, okay, again, I'll refer you to the notes. You can watch videos on these things if you're interested. So, if I've got it in green, it's in 2 Gospels. Purple is in all of the Synoptic Gospels. Red is in all 4 Gospels. So I've kind of got these are key kind of events between these 2 slides, the previous one as well. Purples, greens, and reds. So I just wanted to kind of give you confidence to understand how it is we've tried to do what the next phase will be about. Again, here's a whole list of, this is my list of order of events and where they come from. This was work in progress. Stephen used to come down to London to do some of these things, so you've probably seen this table before. Where I've gone beyond this is now actually trying to integrate the text itself. But hopefully, what we're saying is that when you get it, you can actually, if you really want to, you can actually trace back why it goes where it goes. So I have a stretcher leg, so you can do a quick, but we ought to, let's have a look at the text. Should we do that? Is that okay? So it's actually, why is it not going? So we'll look properly at the birth of Jesus when we actually start the thing, but I just thought it would be nice to see how this works with the prologues. So part 1, I've slightly changed my terminology since I put this slide together, but we'll do that by the next time. The way that if you're reading it, I can understand why. Give it a stretch. I actually decided to start at the end. I juggled around, and you see there are decisions to be made which are aesthetic here. I decided to start with the opening of Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as if it's almost like a title now. And then I dropped into Luke's reason for why he wanted to write. So since many have undertaken to set in order a narrative concerning those matters on which there's full conviction among us, the translation here is totally legitimate, but it isn't exactly the way you might find it, because the reason it isn't the way you might find it is because people, when they were translating, they took a view that Luke's Gospel was written quite a bit later, and they didn't think he was an eyewitness. There's evidence both in the early church and in the Gospels themselves that he was an eyewitness, but he wasn't an eyewitness to everything. And I've actually translated it in a way that slightly highlights that. So I've undertaken to set a narrative concerning those matters on which there's full conviction among us. That's not really controversial, but it's slightly different. But the terminology there is about agreement and together, and that was the source of Matthew's Gospel. But Luke is kind of claiming it as well for himself. And just as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word, i.e. those who agreed together in Matthew's account, just as they were like that, it also seemed good to me, having closely followed everything from the start. Closely followed both encompasses seeing it and also have been aware of it, which actually seems to fit the testimony we have of who Luke was. He's in every single list in the ancient church of the 72, he's always there. Luke is always included as one of the 72. He's there in the book of Acts, as there are men of Cyrene, Lucius of Cyrene, who go to Antioch where they are first called Christians, who therefore commissions Paul by the laying on of hands as a leader in the church there, Lucius of Cyrene. Lucius, my fellow kinsman, he's the character known through the book of Acts as Lucius, which modern scholarship used to say is a totally different name. It's the Roman name, Lucas. Except that we do find now hard, chiselled in stone monuments that refer to people called Lucius by the name Lucas. Same name. So it's no longer relevant to say it's not a Greek name, it's a Roman name. Lucanos, that's it. The Greek name, the Roman name is Lucanos. Anyway, so he's saying, I was around from quite early on, and I followed it from the beginning. I've been involved, and they all had full conviction, and those narratives have come to you. So it also seemed to me to good as well, having closely followed from the start, to write them out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so you might know the certainty of the things in which you're instructed. So Luke is kind of saying, I was aware of this right from the beginning. He's alongside those who've originally agreed together on these Gospels. He has skin in the game, and so he's going to give an account, but he's very specific here. I'm going to write them out in consecutive order. Now, when you try and piece the Gospels together, you think the orders aren't right, but actually they all have an agenda, and the orders make sense of their agendas. And here's the thing, if you treat Luke as saying this is most of the time the actual historical order, it's easier to fit them together than if you treat either Matthew or Mark. Does that make sense? So it feels like that actually Luke has kind of tried to do what he says he's done, which is I've kind of given you these events. Now there's a little bit of natural storytelling. If I tell a story, I might finish a chapter with an arc that when I start the next chapter, if it's a slightly different perspective, I've gone back and there's a bit of overlap between the end of one chapter to the next. Does that make sense? And you can see that a bit in Luke. That there is a little bit sometimes where he kind of gets to here because he's finished that story, then he steps back a little bit and then restarts. So he does that, but on the whole, he's the easiest gospel to treat as a kind of a framework for the order of events. Matthew has been written with discipleship in mind. You can tell that because of the way that the events of Jesus' life illustrate the teaching. And so sometimes what you find is, in the teaching, there's a bit of teaching that in Luke we found was given over here. But the thing is, if Jesus is teaching on this, if Matthew is giving us teaching of Jesus on this issue, and Jesus said something over here, he just drags back the teaching and consolidates it with the rest of the teaching. Makes sense if you're trying to get across the teaching. Jesus is talking about money. Let's put a whole stack of things around money all in the same place. Does that make sense? So he's got a kind of the agenda of a teacher, really, in putting the material together thematically or subject-wise rather than chronologically. Where there are sometimes differences between Luke and Mark, very often Mark is the kind of the difference that you get from an eyewitness, and so probably Mark, in certain small details, is getting the order just a little bit tighter. So that, again, I'm just giving you that flavour. So I moved on from there. This is the prologue. So we start with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Since many have undertaken, this is how it's all come together. So now we get to kind of, if you like, a theological précis of what's coming, or prologue. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This one was in the beginning with God. Everything came to be through him, and without him, not even one thing came to be that has become. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. There's that life and light that goes there in Genesis. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not grasped it. So here's that Psalm 33, word and spirit idea. One of his words I mentioned. I don't really... See, I don't know why I put them in there. Strange place to put them. But then he goes on, going back to Mark. As is written in the prophets. Now, there's a little bit of a thing here, because there are early manuscripts of Mark that don't say prophets. They say in the prophet Isaiah, you see. But very quickly that got dropped, and that's probably because Mark does something which is very Jewish, because he quotes from the prophets, but it's not from Isaiah. So it looks like Mark's made a mistake, you see. As is written in the prophets, see, I send my messenger. I'm just reading the blue at the moment. But actually, the scholarly opinion on this is that probably original Mark does say Isaiah, because actually it's a very rabbinic thing to do when you say, as it says in this situation. And we actually find this in the we find this elsewhere in the Gospels. And then you quote again from another thing to make your point. So what Mark is doing is, just as Isaiah prophesied about the messenger, and don't forget, not only did Isaiah prophesy, it was prophesied elsewhere. So I quote from Malachi, who's also about the messenger who's coming. But we're going to finish with Isaiah. That makes sense. But in the translation, I've gone the majority, which is just put the word prophets, because then I can insert the line from John's Gospel, so we don't lose it. As is written in the prophets, there came a man who was sent from God. That is true. They all prophesied a man who was sent from God. See, I send my messenger ahead of your appearance, who will prepare your way. And that first part is from Malachi, and the preparing the way is a combination of both of Exodus and Isaiah, but finally finishes with Isaiah. So it's kind of consolidating all of those things. But Isaiah is where the idea of the messenger is really rooted. And so although he's also mentioned in Exodus, and he's also mentioned in Malachi, it all comes down together to Isaiah. But in terms of translation, I just thought, well, let's go with the majority. Let's just leave the word Isaiah out, makes it easier to understand. So he came to his own, but his own didn't accept him. But to everyone who did accept him, and those who believed in his name, he gave the authority to become children of God. Not born of blood, nor carnal desire, nor human choice, but of God. And so what you're getting now is, after this introduction, this is good news, Mark. There's a good reason to write. We wanted to get this written down. We've laid it out for you in consecutive order. There was a messenger. We're going to cover him in a second. But the conclusion of all of this is salvation by faith. It's not by works. It's not by carnal desire. It's not by wanting it a lot. It's by faith. It's by the word. It's by God. And the word became flesh and he lived among us. So it's setting up to understand what's coming. It's like that prologue. We look long at his glory, the glory of his as of the Father's only begotten. And even that phrase, you see, again, it's making it plain to the author being an eyewitness. I just want to keep flagging them as we come. So they're not compilers later. The author himself is, we look at his glory, and the glory as of the Father's only begotten, full of grace and truth. John testified about him. He cried out, saying, this is he of whom it was said, he who comes after me has precedence over me, because he was before me. So from his fullness we all receive grace because of grace. So we receive grace because he already had grace. But the law was given through Moses, grace and truth was realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, who's in the heart embrace of the Father. He has declared him, or made him known. He has revealed him. And then we move on. We'll finish with this. There was in the days of Herod of Judea a certain priest named Zechariah. So we're now getting into the details of how did Jesus come. So we've had this sort of introduction, prologue. He belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, whose wife was the daughter of Aaron. So that tells us something. So again, I probably could say this next time. Because he's taking his priesthood seriously. So she's also from Aaron. She's a Levite. Which actually, without meaning to, is starting to tell us something about Jesus' wider family. You stop and think about that. Because Mary herself is actually of the tribe of Judah, because she is a descendant of David. We're told that by Luke in a bit. But equally, her close relative is Mary, who's an Aaronite. So we're beginning to see something, and so Zechariah, as a priest, has married her because she's also from Levi. But if you're from Levi, you don't have to marry in. So it seems that a generation above Jesus' mother has married outside of Levi into Judah. See at least one generation, maybe one, maybe two generations. We begin to see something emerge. They were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and the decrees of the law, but they had no children, inasmuch as Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in years. That was the end. But if you look in your notes, you'll see, I think, at the very end, we have all of that text is highlighted in colour. Is highlighted in Strong's numbers. So on page 37, and you'll notice not all of it is coloured in. I'm just trying to